Hello and welcome back to my channel The Bleach Fanfiction. Join us as we explore the world of fanfiction and fantasy and bring you the best story and discussions. This is the fourth part of What If Ichigo Traveled Back in Time. So give this video a like and subscribe for more videos in future. So let's get into the fanfic. Chapter 9, Godei 13, Here I Come. Suzuki sat bolt upright, hands scrabbling for his zanpakuto even as his eyes adjusted to the dim light. There was something lying on top of him, constricting his movement, suffocating him. A shift in the air around him. His Ryatsu reacted immediately, shaping into the Hado spell he knew like the back of his hand, and he was moments from releasing a stream of red lightning when a warm familiar Ryatsu settled around him soothingly. Suki-chan and Kisuke was suddenly next to him, one arm around his shoulders, pulling him into the older man's arms. Stand down, you're going to bring the house down. What? Before he had finished the sentence, Suzuki instinctively obeyed, pulling his Ryatsu back to shroud himself like a cloak. With the haze of sleep lifted from his mind, he looked around again carefully, to find that he was in his room in the Shihoin compound, and had been struggling with his own blanket. He hoped the room was dark enough to cover the redness of his blush. What happened to everyone? Suzuki rephrased his earlier question. Thanks to your valiant efforts, Kisuke replied drily with no small amount of sarcasm, no one died. Suzuki lowered his head miserably. What he did was a huge gamble, one that could have been costly not only for the Shihoin clan, but for the entire war effort against Aizen. I'm sorry, he whispered quietly. Some of his feelings must have come through, for Kisuke's face softened as he laid Suzuki back down on his futon. Go back to sleep, Suki-chan. You can visit them in the morning. Come again. He must have misheard, because there was no way this was happening. She can never be a field agent, repeated Unohana patiently. That last attack nearly bisected her, it was a miracle she survived long enough to reach treatment. However, the damage was too severe. Half of her major internal organs were shredded to ribbons. We managed to heal the injuries, but at the cost of creating massive amounts of scar tissue that will permanently impede her ability to be active. Suzuki clenched and unclenched his fists, breathing heavily. May I see her? He forced the words out, forcing his voice not to waver. Failure. He failed to keep them safe. Unohana looked at him piercingly. Himura-san does not wish to take any visitors right now. I would like to see her, pressed Suzuki. After a moment of hesitation, Unohana relented. Room, she's sleeping, try not to wake her. The door was ajar when he arrived, and Suzuki nudged it open a fraction more to poke his head inside. She was indeed asleep, skin pale against the white sheets of the futon. He must have made a noise of some kind, for Kied's eyes snapped open, zeroing on him with unerring accuracy. Suzuki stepped forwards. I'm so. Get out, she snarled. Stopping in shock, Suzuki blinked rapidly. I hate you. A single tear trickled from the corner of her eye. Get out of my sight. Rage twisted her features as she struggled to sit up as though to physically throw him from the room, wincing in pain as her body protested. He went. Instead, going back to the Shihoin compound, Suzuki headed straight to the 2nd Division office. The moment he stepped over the threshold of the outer office, Soifun glanced up and was about to say something when she took a good look at his face. Something must have been visible, for her mouth snapped shut and she sat back down in her chair, ignoring the fact that he did not have an appointment scheduled and was technically intruding illegally. Thankful that she did not try to stop him, Suzuki knocked once on the door to the inner office and opened it before Yoruchi had even bid him enter. Ne-sama, I'd like to appeal to take the graduation test early. Suzuki had never been more glad Yoruchi was highly perceptive, came with her job as the commander of the Onmitsukido, but she just nodded without asking him any questions, and the very next day he received an official summons to Onobora's office. I understand that you wish to take the graduation test early, began Onobora without aplomb. Hi, replied Suzuki. You understand that this is highly irregular. Rarely does a first year apply to be allowed to take the graduation test, and even more rarely they are allowed to take it before the academic year has ended, continued Onobora. Hi, repeated Suzuki. Onobora gazed searchingly at him for a while. Recite to me the criteria for graduating from academy, he instructed. The graduation test comprises of 5 compulsory tests and optional specialist exams to improve your chances of being accepted into a division. The compulsory tests examine the subject's history, Hoho, Hakuda, Kido, and Zanko, and are scored out of 10 points each. To successfully graduate in my first year, I will have to achieve a total score of at least 40 as well as demonstrate considerable talent beyond the set curriculum, answered Suzuki promptly. Onobora nodded approvingly. Very well. Come back on Saturday at 9 o'clock for your graduation test. You may take this week off to revise the core subjects and consider what skills you wish to demonstrate for the optional examinations. I will send Jigakucho to invite all interested captains to attend. Thank you very much. Suzuki bowed gratefully. You will not regret giving me this chance. A small rare smile graced Onobora's face. You have been an excellent student, Suzuki-san, and I wish you all the best in your future endeavors. Yoruchi was leaning against the gate, arms crossed, when he arrived back at the compound. You know, she began conversationally when he neared her. It is almost certain that every captain and most vice-captains will be attending your graduation test. And since you're going to be the only student taking it, all their attention will be on you, so do put on a good show, Eni. Suzuki gulped at the dangerous look she was giving him. In fact, just to ensure you don't gravely embarrass the clan, I took the next week off, she continued sweetly. Suzuki did not even manage to let out a strangled scream before he was dragged, kidnapped, to the training grounds. 50 laps around the training grounds every day, until dodging traps became second nature to him. There was no telling what Aizen could do with the DNA he could gain from a single drop of BLD split, even though the man was no scientist, so the most sensible way was to make sure none was split in the first place. In addition, injuries would slow him down, the pain distract him, or in the worst case BLD drip into his eyes and blind him. Just to up the ante, Yoruchi and Kisuke began sparring with him on Nightingale floors littered with traps even more creative and lethal than those in the public Shihoin training grounds, to simulate any possible battles he might come across. Suzuki had no doubt the traps were Kisuke's own CNCPTN, the flair of innovative genius with a touch of insanity was in a class of its own. Senbon tied to self-retracting wires that make it impossible to predict their path of trajectory, for instance. The only way to avoid them was to track them through peripheral vision, while sparring with an opponent who had long mastered the art of multitasking in such a war zone. Of course, the Nightingale floors were also tuned to be extra sensitive to the lightest step, and the only way to move across them was to continuously use Shuanpa so fast his weight was spread out over the entire floor. Treat every combat situation as a war, and he would never be caught off guard. Suzuki pushed the door of the testing dojo open. He paused minutely at the door, taking note of the shocking number of people present, before schooling his features into impassivity. All 13 captains of the Godii 13 as well as their respective lieutenants were in attendance, as well as assorted seated officers. Onobora stood at the front of the dojo, hands clasped, looking completely unruffled at the unprecedentedly large audience. Are you ready, Suzuki-san? He inquired as a formality. The fluid battle stance in which Suzuki strode into the room was already a very clear indication. Hi, Suzuki replied clearly, bowing slightly to his teacher. Onobora bowed back. Normally, a spar would be conducted between 2 students, or between myself and the student in question. However, it has been determined that due to your unique circumstances, a change is necessary. You will be sparring against one of these officers in the Godii to gain the full 40 points for the combat section. You must demonstrate considerable mastery over at least 3 of the 4 fields of Hoho, Zanjutsu, Hakuda, and Kido, as well as above-average competence in the last field. A good knowledge of tactics and overall combat ability will be a bonus. He turned to the assembled officers. This will be an all-out spar. Both Shirkai and Bankai are permitted, as well as any family techniques. This dojo has already been specially reinforced by the Kido Corps in preparation for this battle. May I have volunteers please? Noticing Soifan's shift, Onobora cleared his throat slightly. Due to a possible conflict of interest, no members of the second division may volunteer. There was an awkward pause for a while as everyone looked at each other. None of the captains looked willing to volunteer, since if one of them beat Suzuki up too badly he might have the Shihoin clan after their heads. The clan head herself was right there after all, whereas if they sent someone too inept they would become the laughing stock of Seoul society. Despite being just an academy student, Suzuki had been trained secretly in the Shihoin clan for 4 years, and child prodigies on par with a Fukuteicho were rare but not completely unheard of. For him to be adopted by Yoruchi, Suzuki must have been special enough to catch her eye. Heh. Whatever clan techniques he's got, he's still just a brat. I'll do it, knock him down a few pegs. Finally, a dark-skinned thick-set man drawled, stepping forwards. He unsheathed his Zanpakuto, tapping it idly against his muscular thigh as he waited for Onobora to acknowledge his challenge. Suzuki immediately recognized him as Kiganjo Kenpachi, the predecessor of Zaraki Kenpachi, who was said to have been killed by a single slide of Zaraki's sealed Zanpakuto. Lazy and overconfident, these were Kiganjo's 2 worst flaws, and would serve as his downfall. Now, the question was, would he be allowed to show his true ability, or would he have to hold back? Suzuki, Yoruchi raised her voice slightly, catching his attention. He turned to look at her. Take him down, she stated calmly. With those words, he had just been given free rein to go all out, and no one can blame him for any possible consequences. Perfect. He had been itching for a fight the entire week, anything to get rid of this deep-seated frustration, this helplessness that he failed to save yet another person. But really, Yoruchi must have been really annoyed by the clan brat comment to issue such a challenge. The touch of a smile flitted across his face. Your wish is my command, Wani-sama. He had a lot of pent-up aggression to work out. As Kiganjo made his way to the center of the sparring ring, the onlookers having wisely retreated further in anticipation of his wild swings and tendency to push the protective barrier to its limits, Suzuki considered his options. Suzuki might not have as much muscle as the captain, but he was much more nimble, and as long as he avoided a contest of pure strength he could see himself winning. Judging by Kiganjo's haughty expression, he was either going to stand there and arrogantly offer Suzuki a free first strike, or he was going to charge and try to humiliate him as much as possible. Suzuki relaxed, unfurling his Ryatsu to better sense for attacks. Please bow to your opponent, Onobora instructed. Suzuki bowed properly from the waist, tracking Kiganjo's movements by Ryatsu senses alone. The sharp dispel of air in his direction told him all he needed to know as he dropped to a crouch under the first move, hearing but not registering the cries of disapproval from the onlookers, then used a shunpei-aided leap to the side as the blade came slashing down where he was a moment ago. Suzuki straightens, a safer distance away from Kiganjo, and eyed him warily. The other man was frowning that his victory was not as swift as he hoped, but a wild maniac grin spread across his features as he surveyed Suzuki in a new light. There was no doubt he was a Kenpachi. He had the same smirk that Zaraki Kenpachi did. Very well. Until further circumstances come to light, he would treat the man as another Zaraki. Suzuki unsheathed his Zanpakuto calmly. It was time to test the waters a little. Dashing forwards at his natural speed, Suzuki brought his blade up, and was pleased to note he was not wrong about Kiganjo's own reaction speed. His blade was deftly blocked and Suzuki quickly parried, not wanting to get into a competition of strength with the other man. He skipped backwards, tilting his body to the right to avoid a strike at his vitals. Ooh, getting serious, aren't we? And applied a touch of shunpa to take this chance to appear beside Kiganjo and slash down at the man. Almost immediately he was forced to dodge as the captain recovered impossibly fast, bringing his Zanpakuto back from its outstretched position in the blink of an eye to swing at Suzuki, who was already an afterimage thanks to a deftly applied Utsusimi. Through the rip in the other man's clothing, Suzuki realized that though he had clearly cut the captain, there was no BLD. Kiganjo must have been unconsciously exuding enough Ryatsu that his entire body was impervious to normal strikes. The only reason why Suzuki had not known this already was because he had absolutely no talent in sensing Ryatsu pressures unless he was specifically looking at their spirit ribbons, a fact due to his own immense reserves. For a normal Shinigami, they subconsciously compare the Ryatsu they sense to their own levels, and gauge the other's Ryatsu pressure from there. But to a raging waterfall, all streams look around the same size. He could somewhat sense positions if he concentrated, how many streams there were and where they were, and to some extent match up Ryatsu signatures with their owners if he was familiar with them, but not how much Ryatsu someone had unless it was being actively used, such as for Bankai or other techniques. Faced with this realization, Suzuki bounced on the ball of his feet, blinked twice, and nodded sharply. Slipping to the side nimbly as a Zanpakuto came crashing down in his previous position, Suzuki raised his own blade horizontally, swept his index finger across it, and let sparks of electricity dance down his finger and across the Zanpakuto, wreathing it in a blue-white glow. "Oh, Suzuki Raiden." Yoruchi bounced, clapping cheerfully. She received a raised eyebrow in reply from most of the other officers. Gathered and a few ill-concealed groans at the pun. Onabora merely nodded and added to his clipboard the usage of Heido number 11, Tsuzuri Raiden, without an incantation. Suzuki darted back towards Kiganjo, ducking a punch and blocking the next swipe with his Zanpakuto. A mental command sent the lightning strkng down the connected blade as well thanks to conductivity, and he abruptly relaxed his grip at the same time. The sudden loss of an opposing force added to the mild annoyance the lightning posed, similar to a static shock. Such a low-level Kido was no threat to a captain, of course, caused Kiganjo to overbalance. Capitalizing immediately on the opening he had so painstakingly created, Suzuki channeled Ryatsu into his leg and kicked viciously at the leg supporting the majority of Kiganjo's weight. In the same moment, he brought his Zanpakuto downwards in a two-handed slash, and this time he felt it bite into skin. Kiganjo stumbled under the dual onslaught but managed to catch himself before he fell. Instead he growled incoherently, shaking, and muttered under his breath. Suzuki was forced to jump back as Kiganjo rose again in an avalanche of Ryatsu, his Zanpakuto lengthening and widening. While Kiganjo entered Shirkai, Suzuki studied the unsealed blade in his hand, taking note of the way Kiganjo handled the broadsword and its reach. Directly crossing blades with the captain would not be the wisest course of action, and Hakuta against such an opponent would be suicidal without some form of protection, since it would be sheer arrogance to presume Kiganjo would be drastically slowed by the size of his unsealed Zanpakuto. No matter, Suzuki had demonstrated sufficient Hakuta and Zenjutsu, he hoped, to clear the first two sections. He knew the unspoken regulations. To gain a seated position, he must release his Shirkai during an appropriate portion of the exam. In his case, it would be the combat portion. So few academy students gained their Shirkai that it was never an official part of the rules, but any academy student able to demonstrate a level of competence with their Shirkai usually was offered a seated position. This morning, he had specifically raised the regulated output level on his Ryatsu suppressor, so that he could utilize his Shirkai without collapsing. However, given that his Shirkai form was not in the shape of a sword, he had to clear the Zenjutsu section first before unsealing his Zanpakuto. Given that Kiganjo was already in Shirkai, to leave his Zanpakuto sealed was sheer arrogance that could cause him to be severely injured. All that passed his mind in a split second as he called, "Utara, Kurairashi." The Zanpakuto disappeared from his hand, hilt and all, and without another word crystallized in the middle of the room, spread across the floor at ankle length, crisscrossed into razor-fine wires. It would at the very least slow Kiganjo down while he maneuvered across the room to where Suzuki stood. Seeing the sight, Kiganjo hesitated in his charge. Suzuki was already pressing his advantage. Bakudo no Sunju, Shitatsu Sansen. A trio of yellow triangles coalesced in front of the captain, hitting him and pinning against the far wall. "You think this weak spell can hold me?" Kiganjo roared, his Ryatsu flaring up. Cracks began forming on the yellow light, showing the Bakudo would not be able to handle the strain much longer. "Of course not," Suzuki replied dismissively. "One of the first lessons Kisuke beat into him, never stop firing until he sees his opponent's defeated body. The worst flaw anyone can have in a battle is hubris." Kisuke's first ever direct combat against Aizen stood out as a stark reminder in his mind, for Kisuke was the only one who ever managed to injure Aizen, albeit he healed swiftly, and continuously outwitted the traitor with a barrage of attacks, using anything and everything including his own body as a decoy for his multi-layered plans. If it was not for the Hogyoku, Aizen would have died a dozen times over in that battle. Carriage of thunder, bridge of a spinning wheel. With light, divide this into 6. A bright light emanated from his index finger as he finished his next Kido. Bakudo no Rokujuichi, Rokujikoro. 6 thin, wide beams of light slammed into Kiganjo's midsection, holding him in place just as the previous binding spell was overcome. Immobilized briefly, Kiganjo glared at Suzuki as he gathered his Ryatsu once again. Heido no Gojuhachi, Tenran. Suzuki followed up immediately, holding out a hand before him. A widening tornado-like blast fired towards the immobilized Kiganjo, who was already able to twitch slightly. Without waiting for the dust to clear, Suzuki slid into his fastest Shuanpa and charged straight at Kiganjo behind his last Kido, Kuriarashi shifting itself with a mental command to clear a path for him as he moved. Halfway across the room, he felt Kiganjo's Ryatsu pressure undoubtedly flare, and the wires instantly changed their position, folding themselves upon the captain like a net, sharp edge faced inwards. In the split second after Tenran impacted, Suzuki let loose a battle cry and smashed his Ryatsu-enhanced fist into Kiganjo's right wrist. Snarling in pain, Kiganjo's grip loosened on his broadsword, just as Suzuki planned. Kuriarashi flowed smoothly to knee level and tangled itself between the captain's legs to hopefully trip him. But Kiganjo recovered ridiculously fast, and the broadsword bit deeply into Suzuki's side. Suzuki relaxed, let himself be blasted away by the impact, knowing that resistance would only make the injury worse. Instead, he reappeared behind Kiganjo, and used his momentum to crash heavily into Kiganjo's unprotected back, pinning him to the ground. Jugiki Byakurai. The hole in Kiganjo's shoulder delayed the captain's reaction just a millisecond, which was all Suzuki needed to bring his resealed Zanpakudo up to Kiganjo's neck, drawing a sliver of blood. Kiganjo froze. And then the applause started. Suzuki straightened slowly, coming out of his post-battle adrenaline high, and blinked uncomprehendingly at the observers surrounding him. Yoruchi and Kisuke was happily cheering away, of course, but most of the other officers were also clapping, though some more enthusiastically than others. "Captains, your verdict please," Onabora stated calmly, looking completely unruffled by this turn of events. The sheer amount of raw potential in the Shihoin heir has ceased to amaze him already. Although Suzuki-san is indeed capable and possesses many redeeming qualities, the First Division does not have a suitable position open for him at this moment. The vice-captain Chojuro Sasakai bowed slightly to Suzuki, who returned it, not at all bothered. He had no interest in the First Division anyway, though it would have been a great honor to be offered a position there. Yoruchi was next. The Second Division would like to make the offer of joint third seat to Suzuki-san, she said formally, but ruined the formal atmosphere by tossing Suzuki a small smile. Suzuki blinked twice quickly, the only sign of how surprised he was at the unexpectedly high seat number. It was as high as she could make it. Yoruchi was not going to give up captaincy, vice-captain had to be Soifan for political reasons, and her third seat was Kisuke. To offer him a joint third seat instead of the open fourth seat was a clear statement of her expectations and his responsibilities. Next was Rojuro Odoribashi. The Third Division would like to offer the sixth seat to Suzuki-san, in recognition of his positive attitude in the face of adversity, the laid-back man declared, throwing Suzuki a wink as he did so. Suzuki blinked slowly back. It was Unohana's turn. Although Suzuki-san did not demonstrate the stellar control over his Ryatsu I generally look for in candidates, I would like to offer him the 4th Division 7th seat in recognition of his overwhelming potential as a frontline combat medic. Suzuki-san's Shirkai, Ryatsu reserves, and unparalleled speed can save many lives in the immediate aftermath of a hollow encounter should he be equipped with several medical Kido that rely more on Ryatsu output rather than control. The 5th Division shall offer the 4th position to Suzuki-san, due to his well-rounded abilities and combat readiness. What do you think of choral music? And suddenly Shinji was grinning at Suzuki as if he had known him all his life, and Suzuki focused on the once visored, future visored. With all his might, pretending his heart did not skip a beat at the mere glimpse of Aizen out of the corner of his eye. Jinrei stepped up. The 6th Division would like to offer the 8th position to Suzuki-san, after seeing the versatility of his Shirkai and its potential in keeping law and order. The 7th Division wishes to offer the 3rd seat to Suzuki-san. And that was Ikawa Love, short and to the point. Kairaku was next. The 8th Division would like to honor Suzuki-san's capability, however unfortunately all our top-seeded positions are already filled. He gave a careless shrug, smiling at Suzuki under the rim of his wide hat. Suzuki bowed back in response. The 9th Division offers the 5th position to Suzuki-san, in light of how effective his Shirkai would be in the capture and detainment of criminals for internal law enforcement. Kensei was all business, Mashiro a hyperactive ball of energy next to him. The 10th Division recognizes Suzuki-san's prowess and would like to offer the 4th seat to Suzuki-san. Suzuki mentally snorted at the exaggerated praise from his father. Good job, Ishin added silently. Then, as if it pained him to be solemn and formal for so long, my darling son has grown up and is beating up captains now. Suzuki replied with the mental equivalent of a dropkick. Been doing that since I was 15, he snapped as Ishin sent back a mental image of tears streaming down from both eyes. Hell yeah. I haven't had a fight that good for ages. Kid, if you come to the 11th Division, you can take the vice-captain position. Kiganjo positively leered. Suzuki winced slightly. Great, just what he needed. Another Kenpachi chasing him for a good fight. No way in hell was he joining the 11th, not even with the ridiculously high position he was offered. While the 12th Division greatly respects Suzuki-san's combat ability, began Hikifune Kiryu, we believe he does not have the passion for innovation and technology necessary for a career in our division. She inclined her head politely toward Suzuki, who nodded back, not at all insulted by her words. He might respect Kisuke a great deal, but joining the research division was too far a stretch for him. Not to mention sometimes even Kisuke calls the rest of his division a bunch of incompetent fools, though it was no fault of Hikifune's. Most of the ones who do end up picking the 12th Division were either socially inept nerds whose heads were so full of science they had no common sense, or those with too little combat ability and no burning longing to learn medical Kido. Finally, Yukitake stepped up, coughing lightly. The 13th Division thinks Suzuki-san would make an excellent support-type fighter and thus would like to offer the 6th seat position to Suzuki-san. Onobora nodded at all the captains and spoke up again. What is your choice, Shihoin Suzuki-san? He had made his choice long ago, before he had stepped into the testing dojo, possibly before he had even entered the academy. He had told no one of his goal, fearing she would not make an offer for him. This time, he would save them all with his own 2 hands. I would like to join the 4th Division. Chapter 10, Take the World by Storm, Enter the 4th. So, 4th Division, Yoruchi took a bite of her grilled saba, stating conversationally. Soifun glared at him as if he had grievously offended her. Suzuki kept his head down and ate quietly. The moment he had stated his choice of division, half the officers were up and shouting, incredulous voices exchanging opinions back and forth. Even Unohana herself had looked surprised, a rare expression on the normally serene captain's face. After all, most of the other captains had offered out of obligation, fully expecting to be rejected. Although, he sneaked a peek at Yoruchi's calm expression, it seemed as the Shihoin head had already predicted this outcome. Kisuke thought it was rather obvious, replied Yoruchi to his unspoken question, smirking. And naturally, what the blonde knew, she knew. Arg! Soifun exclaimed loudly, tossing down her chopsticks and rising from the table. It was no secret Kisuke's close friendship with Yoruchi annoyed her to no end. Add that to the topic at hand, and it was no wonder that she was stomping out of the dining room in a fit of temper. Suzuki glanced back at Yoruchi. Perhaps that was the conniving cat's intention all along, for they were now alone. So, 4th Division, any? Yoruchi repeated. Without prompting, she revealed her thoughts on the matter. I know of the Combat Medic Subdivision. It isn't even big enough to warrant its own division like the Onmitsukido or the Kidoshu. It is the elite of the elite medics in Siriidii, hand-picked by Anohana Taicho to be both capable of holding their own in the battlefield and proficient in Kaido. In return, she expects a lot from candidates and is much harder on them than the rest of her division. There's a reason why even the 11th Division fears her wrath after all. Yoruchi leveled a gaze on Suzuki. So, I know Anohana Taicho, and she isn't the type to potentially waste all that effort trying to recruit someone whom everyone expects to join the Onmitsukido. She continued looking at Suzuki expectantly. Yeah. Suzuki swallowed and stared at the floor. That day, after I saw Himura-san, I asked her if she can consider me for her combat medic subdivision. She said she'll think about it when I graduate. He burst out, I just couldn't help but think, if I had known Kaido, then maybe I could have done something, helped Himura-san before her injuries became irreversible. Suzuki, interrupted Yoruchi gently. It's not healthy to keep blaming yourself. You got her to medical attention in record time, and healing using Ryatsu isn't the same as Inoue-chan's rejection. There are injuries you just can't heal with Kaido, because Kaido only speeds up the body's natural recovery process using a boost from the medic's Ryatsu. Inoue-chan simply resets the body to its previous condition, but no matter how good at Kaido you become, you won't be able to turn back time. I know, Suzuki whispered miserably. I know I probably couldn't have done anything about it in this case, but I'm sick of watching people bleed to death in front of my eyes, because there are too few medics to go around, and even fewer capable of braving the front lines. I don't want to feel this helpless anymore. I want to feel like I'm doing something, and working to become a combat medic makes me feel like I'm doing something useful. That's why I joined the 4th. He stared at Yoruchi, willing her to understand. Yoruchi pursed her lips and gazed searchingly at him for a long while. Suzuki did not flinch from her scrutiny, even when the smallest of frowns tugged at her brow. He knew that he had thrown possibly years of strong work out of the window by unexpectedly deviating from the plan, but he also felt that it was the right thing to do. Whether as Kurosaki Ichigo or Shihoin Suzuki, he would always do what he felt was necessary, and to hell with anyone who believed otherwise. She blew out a long breath. Make us proud, she informed him. I will, promised Suzuki. Welcome to the Combat Medic Subdivision, Suzuki-san, greeted Unohana. These are your senpai. She gestured to the group of Shinigami standing behind her. They took it as her cue to step up and introduce themselves. Salutations, Suzuki-san. I am Yamada Sinasuke, the lieutenant. A young man with black hair and black eyes was the first to speak. Strictly speaking, Anohana Taicho and I are not part of the Combat Medic Subdivision as we both have other duties to attend to, however, we are both capable combat medics. Hello Suzuki-san, I am the 3rd seat, Nakamura Kenji. I am normally in charge of this subdivision. Pleased to meet you. A nondescript middle-aged man stepped up. I'm Kato Natsumi, the 5th seat. Pleased to meet you. A bubbly girl with her brown hair gathered in a ponytail on the right side of her head bobbed her head. Sixth seat Watanabe Kotaro, pleased to meet you, mumbled the last boy, who looked even younger than Suzuki did, though appearance meant nothing in terms of actual age in Seoul society. Suzuki bowed back. Pleased to meet you all. He glanced around again. That was all. Unohana took note of his faintly quizzical look to explain. Very few have the potential to blossom as a combat medic, and of those who do, even fewer choose to undergo the grueling training required. Most new graduates dream of becoming heroes on the battlefield, and the fourth is rarely someone's first choice. Including him, there were only 6 combat medics in the whole of the Gotei 13. What made you pick me? He asked, honestly curious. His Ryatsu control was utterly awful and his demeanor completely different from what one would expect of a healer. Then again, if someone like Ishin could become a doctor. A fleeting smile graced the captain's visage. There are many things I look for in candidates. Above average Ryatsu reserves, the form of their Shirkai, inherent combat ability, just to name a few, but above all, what I really want to see is a longing to help others in need, and the will to make it happen. You have demonstrated both admirably. Suzuki could only bow in response. A gentle breeze blew into his bedroom from the open window as Suzuki set about laying his futon for the night. A clatter of clogs on the windowsill, a flutter of a robe in the wind. Suzuki did not verbally acknowledge Kisuke's presence, although he paused in his actions, remaining kneeling beside the shikibutan he had just laid out, one hand still tucked between the folds of his cakebutan. Hands landed lightly but firmly on his shoulders. Are you sure about this? Kisuke asked quietly. Suzuki bowed his head, gazing unseeingly at his futon mattress. Was he sure about his decision? Certainly, anyone who knew him so well would be worried whether he was doing it as a form of penitence for Himura-san's injury, but Suzuki knew it was more than that. He had wanted to be a doctor ever since he had been a helpless 9-year-old crying his eyes out over his mother's dead body. It was one of the reasons why he had always studied so strong. Being on the front lines of a war, he had held countless allies as they died in his arms, the healers always too few, too late. The moment Unohana Taicho had died, the war was effectively already over. Yeah, I am. One of the hands patted his shoulder. Well then, responded Kisuke cheerfully. Let's see how we can turn this to our advantage, then. Suzuki's head snapped up and he twisted his body around to stare incredulously at Kisuke. No recriminations, no admonishments, just simple acceptance. Kisuke was smiling, open and friendly, the familiar calculating glint in his eye as he considered the matter. The sight of it made something inside Suzuki ache because Kisuke had never looked like that anymore, not after the visors, unexpected stubborn streak and willingness to rebel against what some would view as your destined position. He mused out loud. Yes, I think we can work with this. He took the covers from Suzuki's hands, and nudged the unresisting male to the side. Don't you have servants to help you with these things? Asked Kisuke conversationally as he expertly flicked the cakebutan open, whipped the thick quilt through the air and let it settle, perfectly aligned over the shikibutan already laid out on the tatami. Suzuki watched enviously and wondered when, if ever, he would be able to do that. I can do it myself, he retorted. I don't need to be bathed and dressed like an invalid. The blonde made a noncommittal noise, flipping the nearest corner of the covers open and gesturing Suzuki to get in. I'm not a child anymore, Suzuki protested. Kisuke merely tilted his head and made a shooing motion. Compromising, he climbed under the covers, but remained sitting, the cakebutan pooling in his lap. I didn't say you were one, the former shopkeeper finally replied, though your behavior sometimes makes me wonder. He raised an eyebrow at Suzuki's grimace and nodded at the muttered apology. They remained in a comfortable silence for a while. Thanks. Kisuke only smiled. Oyasumi. He stood, dusted himself off and hopped out of the window. The Gotei 13 operated on a rotating duty system, where each of the 7 non-specialized divisions was on call for a different day of the week. On-call meant that any problems that arose were first directed to that division, regardless of whether it normally fell under their jurisdiction. For instance, a sudden hollow attack on a patrolling squadron would prompt whichever division that was on call to send backup, in addition to the division to whom the original patrol belonged. Captains and lieutenants were required to report at regular work hours for 5 days a week on alternating schedules, such that there was always at least one commanding officer available in the division during work hours. If the division was on call, both were required to be present throughout both shifts. In serious emergencies, an alarm would sound, alerting all squadrons currently on duty in all the divisions to respond. Should the alarm persist, all off-duty members were required to report to their superiors and await further instructions. The 6 specialized divisions, 1st, 2nd, 4th, 9th, 11th and 12th, had different duty rosters. The 2nd Division traditionally was headed by the head of the Shihoin clan, who also supplied a large number of the recruits. Unlike the non-specialized divisions, the seated officers were split into 5 commanders and 15 Onmitsukido squadron leaders, and the division was active 24/. Requests to the Onmitsukido came primarily from Central 46, other noble families, or the 1st Division. These would be reviewed by the lieutenant, then submitted to the captain for approval. The top 5 seated officers were each in charge of a different subdivision, and had 3 squadron leaders reporting to him or her. The 4th Division, being essentially the only source of medical care in Siriidii, had no time to rest. Unseated Shinigami operated round the clock in 3 shifts of 8 hours each, while senior seated officers could be required to remain on call for entire days during times of heavy casualties when all qualified medics were needed to save as many lives as possible. Due to their unique situation, the Combat Medic Division was permanently on call, similar to the 11th Division. It was also for this reason that combat medics were the only Shinigami permitted to carry their Zanpakuto and Ajigakucho at all times, even if they were not at work. Should an alarm sound, all combat medics were required to report regardless of where they were and what they were doing, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In addition, Unohana Taicho could choose to activate the Combat Medic Division for support, should she deem it necessary, for any other combat-related alerts that came to the 4th Division. Since they were often required to take part in actual battle on the front lines, rigorous physical conditioning as well as regular sparring was a necessity. Although they were not required to work in the infirmary or relief station, they had to familiarize themselves with their layouts, such that they would be able to quickly bring an injured from the battlefield to the right place. They also attended all classes held for the field and infirmary medics, such that they had at least a theoretical knowledge of Kaido techniques even if they did not have the finesse to implement them. Even with a Vasto Lord breathing down your neck, you do not leave a patient. Understood? Suzuki revised his opinion of Unohana Taicho. She was terrifying. The academy is organizing another student patrol, began Unohana without aplomb. Due to the recent surge in hollow activity in the human world, we have been requested to remain on standby in case of emergency. She looked at the assembled 4th Division members. Will those on duty today afternoon report to their assigned squadron leaders please? Amidst the organized chaos, Unohana moved to the side where the Combat Medic Division was gathered and spoke quietly, all of you, maintain your usual positions please. Shihoin-san, as this is your first time being on call, please follow Kenji-kun for today. Hi, they responded as one, rechecking their medical kits one last time and making sure they were fully stocked. The 4th Division medical kit was a light blue backpack designed to be slung over one shoulder, with the kanji 4 embossed on the back. Being senior officers and combat medics, their medical kits contained a greater variety of items than the standard version, some of which were forbidden outside the battlefield. It was rather pointless wondering if they were all prepared for nothing, Suzuki reflected as the alarm sounded and the Combat Medic Division immediately left at a shunpated run while the field medics were still scrambling for their equipment. Of course something was going to go wrong. What had Himura-san said? 1 in 15 patrols would encounter hollows. He briefly wondered if Kisuke would be inclined to make a better barrier for the patrols, to cut down on the death rate. Then there was no time for thought as they hurled through the Senkamen, a Jigakucho on each of their shoulders acting as both a beacon and a means of communication if necessary. A flash of light and then he was staring up at a cloudless midday sky. It was almost a peaceful sight except for the screaming students running for their lives. Kenji immediately shot to the left, where Suzuki could sense that the bulk of the hollows were, while the other two moved to flank the fleeing students. A few were desperate enough to turn towards the medic Senkamen, but were quickly disabused of that notion lest they were run over in the Dangai by the incoming field medics. Suzuki scanned the horizon, looking for the squad on duty. Dressed in black, they would stand out like sore thumbs amidst the sea of white academy uniforms. Unfortunately, it looked as if they were the first ones on the scene. Midoretabu, Tetsuo. Kenji's Zanpakuto scattered into fragments, and even with his trained eyes Suzuki could barely pick up the distortions in the air where they dispersed. With a sharply barked command word, the blades began to spin, generating a tunnel of violent winds around the students, repelling the hollows. With nary a glance at each other, Suzuki and Kenji took up positions at each end of the tunnel, picking off the hollows that came their way. With a loud clang, a second Senkamen opened in the distance. Sure took their time, Kenji grumbled softly, straightening. A pink floral haori was the first thing Suzuki saw and he sighed quietly. That might explain the delay. Although Kairaku was by no means as inept as he sometimes pretended to be, he likely was not in his office during the alert and had to be tracked down first. Indeed, when the smoke cleared to reveal the two commanding officers, even from this distance Suzuki could see that Lisa was dragging him by his ear, and probably had been doing so since the moment she found him. Kenji was already snapping terse commands, pointing the students in the direction of the second Senkamen. The moment the last of the 8th Division squads cleared the Senkamen, the students would be sent through. Go! With a wave of his hand, the wind tunnel began moving along with the fleeing students, breaking off behind the last person and reforming rapidly ahead of the first one, shredding any hollows that dared to come too near. Kenji glanced over at him, eyes flickering over to the scattered Ryatsu signatures dotting the field. Suzuki gave him a terse nod and sped off, trusting the third seat to see this group of students to safety. Putting on an extra burst of speed, he began scouring the perimeter where the 8th had not reached yet. Did someone use hollow bait or something? Academy students, even in a group, should not have enough Ryatsu to attract so many hollows. Suzuki cut through another swathe of low-level hollows, pausing minutely as he identified a splash of red and blue amongst the black and white background. He recognized that figure. Worse, he recognized that a hollow was headed straight for his unprotected back. Akira! Get down! Akira reacted instinctively to the command, dropping to the ground even as he yelped in surprise. Suzuki-san. A beam of red light skewered through the hollow's mask from the back of its head as Suzuki flashed over. He took in the situation in one glance. 3 low-level hollows bearing down on them, 1 reasonably proficient combatant, 1 unconscious student on the ground. Hold them off, Suzuki instructed, dropping to his knees, laying a hand on the injured girl. His Ryatsu hovered around the two of them, enough to give him warning if a hollow chose to attack, but not enough to shield. He needed his concentration elsewhere. Green light briefly swept her from head to toe, seeking out abnormalities. Skull, rough jostling in the past few minutes, possible concussion but no nerve damage, no internal bleeding, all 51 skull bones accounted for. Vertebrae intact, trachea intact, no blockage in airways, lungs intact, breathing rate normal. Ribcage cracked, but heart and surrounding major BLD vessels functional. Multiple. Minor epidermal. Lacerations, Suzuki skipped over their exact locations, not life-threatening, not important. The original blow was to abdomen region, knocking her backwards and she landed badly on her leg. Fractured femur, but femoral artery and nerves in the region intact, no other potentially fatal wounds. The diagnostic process took over a minute to complete, but that was to be expected of a new medic. Suzuki carefully silenced the pain transmissions from her leg temporarily and wrapped a thick layer of Ryatsu over her leg to prevent further injury during transport. The moment he rose, Akira was by his side, expectant. "Can you carry her?" With a sharp nod, the other student moved to do just that. Suzuki flitted forwards, cutting down the hollows between them and the Senkamen while Akira broke into a shunpei-aided run. "Keep going and don't stop until you reach Soul Society." Without wasting breath to reply, Akira sped up, ignoring the hollows in his path. His trust was not misplaced as the hollows dissolved into erasure before they could reach him, Suzuki moving so fast he was almost a blur to Akira's eyes. A shrill whistle sounded, the perimeter was secure and the gargantas closed. All that was left was to purify the remaining hollows. Suzuki stopped following when there were no more hollows between Akira and the Senkamen, though he visually ensured the other had stepped fully through before turning to join the cleanup. To his surprise, Akira was waiting for him on the other side when he returned, falling into step beside him as Suzuki made his way to the 4th Division to be debriefed. "I never see you anymore," the other finally broke the silence. Suzuki hummed noncommittally. "I've been busy." "So I heard," agreed Akira. "I read up a little on combat medics, they seem to have the longest working hours in the Gotei 13. Suzuki did turn and raise an eyebrow at him. "The school rumor mill really knows everything. But surely you do get off duty sometime?" Akira asked quietly. "There are times when I'm not required to be physically present in the 4th Division, Suzuki replied wryly. Though whether that counts as off-duty is another matter. They had reached the crossroads between the academy and the Gotei 13 Division grounds. By unspoken agreement, both stopped. "I was wondering," Akira cleared his throat, "if you're free next Saturday." "Yeah," he found himself agreeing. "Yeah, next Saturday works." Anyone who ever thought the 4th Division was easy ought to spend a day in the Combat Medic Division, decided Suzuki, gasping for breath, hands stinging. He shook his hands out, closed his eyes briefly, and then returned to his practical work. He would get it right this time. "I need a medic." The clipboard he was holding slipped from his hands, landing with a clatter on the floor of an empty storeroom, whose ajar door was still swngng from the force it was ripped open with. He knew that voice. As he raced down the familiar corridors of the infirmary, the voice shouted again, closer this time, tinged with annoyance over the general cacophony. "What happened?" he barked before he even skidded into main courtyard, where the voice had been coming from. Without waiting for an answer, he spun and pointed at the nearest Shinigami. "You, fetch the 4th seat." Soifun glanced up in surprise as the unsure unseated Shinigami milling about parted instantly for him, allowing him to see the body she had laid on the ground. "Well?" he asked tersely as his hands lit green with a basic diagnosis Kaido. "Break in at Maggot's Nest," replied Soifun equally succinctly. "Is it ongoing?" Suzuki asked, a little disbelievingly. Who the world would want to break into Maggot's Nest? "Ongoing attempt to rescue a new prisoner," explained Soifun. "On Mitsukido backup in progress. Requesting for medical backup." Suzuki nodded once to show his understanding, deactivating the Kaido. Reaching backwards, he unzipped the medical kit on his back without taking it off and pulled out his Jigakucho container, unscrewing it gently to let the butterfly flutter gently onto the tip of his finger. To Unohana Taicho, emergency medical attention required at Maggot's Nest. Live combat zone. He let the black butterfly go, then turned to the newly arrived 4th seat. Asphyxiation, trachea completely collapsed. 2 fractured fixed ribs, punctured superior lobe in right lung, near azygous vein. Repeated blunt trauma injury to cranium suggestive of subdural hematoma. Status critical. Understood. Soifun stood with him, giving the experienced officer space to work. Suzuki cast an eye over the unseated Shinigami and 2 junior-seated officers, grimacing slightly. None of them would be of much help in a regular live combat zone, much less the maggot's nest, where they would have to rely on unarmed combat alone. It was evident that Soifan had come to the same conclusion, for she simply gave him a pointed look and turned to head out. Suzuki removed his zanpakuto and handed it to the closest junior seated officer. "Please put that in my quarters." Before the other could do more than splutter, both of them disappeared with a loud bang. At least, that was what it looked and sounded like to the ordinary Shinigami, whose eyes were unable to keep up with the Shunpa-enhanced speed that students of the Goddess of Flash were capable of, and could only perceive the aftershock created by their simultaneous breaking of the sound barrier. It was utter chaos. Screams and MMS of the wounded and dying saturated the air within the prison, accompanied by the sounds of fighting and the occasional debris raining from attacks. The Onmitsukido were outnumbered and generally outgunned, since the intruders clearly did not adhere to the no-weapon rule. "Move aside," shouted Soifan as they barreled into the prison, splitting up almost before they had cleared the doors to rocket into one intruder each. Using his momentum, Suzuki bodily picked up his opponent and threw him into the biggest mass of intruders he could spot, successfully taking them by surprise. A few went down, while the remaining staggered to their feet, besieged by Onmitsukido members on all sides. Status report. "The main invading force has penetrated into the third level," hollered back a squadron leader. "Some of them are at senior officer level. We can't hold them." "Where the hell is that Urahara?" shrieked Soifan. "Off duty today." He had heard enough. "I'm going ahead," he yelled. "Soifan, you take the rest here." "Onegai shimasu, Suzuki-sama." "Oh no you don't," roared one of the invaders, only to find that the man he had been charging straight at suddenly vanished. He blinked uncomprehendingly, once, and then his world abruptly tilted and went black. Having taken the man down with a quick chop to the jugular, Suzuki was already halfway down the corridor leading to the stairs. Giving the spiral staircase a slight grimace, he rested a hand on the railing and neatly flipped himself over with enough force to ricochet off the opposite railing one floor down, catching the railing of the staircase leading to the third floor and SWNGNG himself over into the entrance. Here the sounds of battle was much fainter, but from what he could hear it was much fiercer. When he arrived in the main prison hall he understood why that was so. A quick pulse of Ryatsu confirmed that everyone except two senior seated officers was dead, and the latter two would not last much longer. He considered his options, took a deep breath, and gathered his Ryatsu. Bakudo number 62, Hyaparankan. He flung the blue-white rod of energy that formed in his hand towards the bulk of the invaders, careful to aim at an angle that would avoid the two Onmitsukido members. This Bakudo was one of the few high-leveled ones that was thus ranked primarily due to the Ryatsu needed to fuel the formation of the multiple rods, instead of a need for control. Even if he put too much Ryatsu into it, it would only result in more rods than the initial 100 being generated, perfect against multiple enemies in an enclosed area. As planned, many of the intruders were temporarily immobilized, while the rest spun to face him, leaving the two officers to stagger away and collapse gratefully against the furthest wall possible. Suzuki put a hand on his hip and surveyed the opposition coolly. 18 weaker invaders and 6 strong ones, weaker being a relative term since all of them would easily be at the level of a seated officer, with the strongest duo averaging around the level of lieutenant. No wonder the Onmitsukido seated officers were having trouble. His first Bakudo had skewered 14 of them, but it would not hold them permanently. "That's a pretty good Kido for a 4th division dog," sneered one of them, whom Suzuki assumed was the leader given how the rest seemed to look to him for orders. "Thank you for the compliment," he replied calmly, contemplating his next move. While the small fry would not be able to injure him significantly even with his Ryatsu limiter on, their sheer numbers could prove too annoying, like the continual sting of mosquitoes. "Don't worry, he can't be ranked higher than 3rd seat, he has neither a lieutenant badge nor a captain's Haori," the leader rallied his men. Suzuki's eyes narrowed. So at least one of them had knowledge of Shinigami uniform standards, suggesting one or more of them might be Shinigami deserters. His eyes flitted over the hilts of what he had assumed to be normal swords, but now re-evaluated to be possible Zanpakuto, which meant there was a probability of Shirkai. Against a worst-case scenario of 8 possible unknown Shirkai and 16 other attackers, the odds of coming out completely uninjured was rather unlikely. As many of the small fry must be incapacitated as possible, which left. That is true, I am a mere 7th seat, agreed Suzuki out loud, inclining his head briefly. Yoroshiku. The leader's eyebrows furrowed. Are you looking down on us? He demanded, offended by the choice of salutation, which indicated that Suzuki considered him of a lower social status. In actual fact that was true, but from his point of view, he had just been slighted by a 7th seat, who moreover was from what was widely seen the weakest division. Get him, he snarled. Suzuki flexed his shoulders, and flared his entire available Ryatsu in a massive flood directed at the charging mass to avoid hurting the 2 Onmitsukido officers. 17 of them collapsed from the intense pressure, which was more than he hoped for but less than ideal. Suzuki pursed his lips. Had he access to his full Ryatsu capacity, the battle would already be over. Of the remaining 7, 2 were still struggling against his first Bakudo, leaving 5 of them. Oi, boss, you didn't tell me a 7th seat could be so powerful, one of them gasped, staggering upright. There's no way he's a 7th seat, snapped the leader. He must be a 3rd seat. No, I cannot even hope to match the 2nd Division's 3rd seat, refuted Suzuki. If he were here, all of you would already be unconscious or in chains. Probably both. Then we'll have to take you out before he gets here. At a signal, all 5 released their respective Shirkai. Suzuki sighed. This was going to be troublesome. Without knowing their abilities, he could only hazard a guess that 2 of them were physical type, since these Zanpakuto clearly changed their shapes. The other 3 were more likely to be Kido types, though they might have special abilities that could give even him some trouble. Even physical, type Zanpakuto could be dangerous from a distance, as evidenced by Zangetsu's Getsuga Tensho. In that case, all he had to do. Suzuki went low and left strong and fast, sweeping one of them off his feet with a brutal kick to the back of the knee while the other Zanpakuto clashed into each other. He spun and slid into a rapid shunpa he normally saved for serious battles, dislocating the wielding arm of a Kido-type Zanpakuto user with a sharp crack and kicking his Zanpakuto into a far wall. 2 down. Was take them out first. The other 3 drew back a little, more cautiously. Suzuki backed away as well, keeping the 2 down Shinigami in view. His studies of anatomy was not yet good enough to fully incapacitate them, but hopefully the pain would keep them down long enough for him to take out the rest. Unfortunately, they were at an advantage. He was unarmed and there was no Kido in his highly limited repertoire that was usable in battle. His favorite Heido, Jugiki Byakurai, had high penetrating power unsuitable for confined spaces. The only Bakudo he could cast rapidly without an incantation were not meant for combat purposes. His knowledge of Kaido was not yet sufficiently internalized for him to be able to utilize medical Kido in a 3-on-1 fight, even though he had the speed to execute the necessary techniques. He could not afford to concentrate on one opponent alone. He had stayed still for too long. Suzuki moved, narrowly avoiding a blast from one of the Zanpakuto. It was at the speed of an Arrancar bala. Not good. The 2 physical type users had closed ranks, and they were coming at him from opposite sides, while the leader fell backwards, readying his Zanpakuto for another one of those blasts. Pincher formation. A chain sailed through the air, missing him by inches, but even before it curved like a boomerang Suzuki could see that it was not meant to hit him in the first place. Channeling Ryatsu to his legs, Suzuki leapt upwards before the chain could wrap itself around his body, somersaulting in mid-air and twisting his body to avoid a strike from the other Shinigami. He was most vulnerable in the air, as he could not change direction until he could land. Or so they thought. As the chain whipped upwards towards him at the same time the other Zanpakuto slashed towards where he would be landing had he been in free fall, Suzuki completed his somersault in the air and grabbed the chain with one hand, causing it to tangle around the other Zanpakuto. Suzuri Raiden. With a cry of pain both Shinigami collapsed, convulsing from the electric current coursing through their bodies. They would not be getting up for a while. Suzuki landed on the ball of his feet, reining in the Ryatsu that had been suppressing the other weaker opponents to wrap around himself as a shield, just in time to block another one of those Kido blasts from his last opponent. Features twisted in rage, the leader shouted a war cry and dashed forwards at Shuunpa enhanced speed. A shift in the air, as though stirred by a breeze. The leader lunged. Suzuki stood still, relaxed. Unconcerned. Rikujikoro. 6 beams of light emerged from the attacker's torso, freezing him in place before he completed his motion, Zanpakuto still outstretched uselessly. And this, introduced Suzuki, feeling a little mischievous, is the third seat. Kisuke blinked twice at him, withdrawing his hand from the other. Man's back. Good. Afternoon, Shihoin-san, he greeted, immediately catching on. This was met by stunned silence. Shihoin, one of them squawked. Ah, did I forget to introduce myself? I am Shihoin Suzuki, heir to the Shihoin clan, current 7th seat of the 4th division. Suzuki gave a small dip of the head, as regal as he had seen the clan elders do. Because of your lack of proficiency in Kido, teased Kisuke. That is true, I have much to learn from Anohana Taicho. However, if you consider my combat ability outside the constraints of a confined building with allies trapped nearby, during my academy graduation exam I defeated Kenpachi Taicho, he replied haughtily, moving off to examine the 2 Onmitsukido members, who were stumbling to their feet now that the battle was over. Both were bleeding from multiple cuts, one of them had a cracked fibula, but neither was in any immediate life-threatening danger. The one with a broken leg would be problematic to transport up the stairs, however. I think this one just wet himself, informed Kisuke, having finished securing the last of them with Ryatsu repressing HNDCFFS. Suzuki raised an eyebrow at him, before sighing and tapping the lumbosacral region of the spinal cord with a finger, sending a bolt of Ryatsu to overload the axons in that region to temporarily shut off all sensory and motor functions to the lower limbs, and then wrapped it securely in a thick layer of Ryatsu. He hoisted the temporarily paralyzed officer in a fireman's carry, careful not to jar his leg too much. Is the 4th division here yet? He asked, beckoning to the other officer and starting towards the exit. They're in the main courtyard, called Kisuke, now tying them up in one line. Raising his free hand to show that he had heard, Suzuki surveyed the staircase leading out of the prison. The climbing motion would be uncomfortable for the man he was carrying no matter how much he tried to keep his upper body still, not to mention speed would be beneficial. Coming to a decision, he gestured to the other officer to come to him, wrapped an arm around the other's waist, gathered Ryatsu to his feet, and leapt straight from a standing position. The angle and force he had kicked off had allowed him to shoot right past the railing on the ground floor, coming down in a highly controlled descent gently onto the floor. Letting go of the other man, Suzuki made his way out into the main courtyard, where indeed the 4th division had set up camp. Spotting a few stations without a patient, he strode to the nearest one and gently laid down his burden. Suzuki then lifted the cloak of Ryatsu he had wrapped tightly around the pair of them, which he had been using in lieu of bandages to prevent their injuries from worsening during transport. Status report please. Unohana had come up behind him. Suzuki stood to attention, voice crisp and clear, exactly the way she had drilled into him. Maggot's nest, 3rd level, all clear. Urahara Sanseki is sweeping the perimeter. 2 survivors, non-fatal injuries. 24 captured, all at seated officer level, no permanent injuries on any. Unohana examined him closely. And yourself? Uninjured. She eyed him for a little longer, evidently checking him for injuries, then nodded briskly. Good work. Please return to your stock-taking. Understood. Suzuki bowed, and walked out of the courtyard with his head held high, ignoring all the looks directed at him. You made it. Suzuki made his way through the crowd thronging to get into Junranen, to reach Akira who was waiting off to the side beside the north gate. As he neared, Akira pushed himself off the wall and fell into step beside him. "I've never seen you out of uniform before," remarked Akira. "But," he peered at Suzuki, "why a yukata?" Akira himself was dressed in a simple dark-colored cotton kimono, a more conservative version of what most Shinigami considered appropriate off-duty clothing. Suzuki winced inwardly as he remembered the eye-wrenching colors Renji usually turned up in. Even if pink had technically matched his hair. Suzuki coughed, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "I don't go out very often," he admitted quietly. "The only casual clothing I found in my wardrobe are yukata." Akira smiled at him. "Don't worry, this is Junranen, not one of the upper districts, festival or no, a yukata wouldn't be out of place." Even a persimmon-colored yukata with a spray of white blossoms running up one side, was what was left unsaid. Suzuki had no idea who had bought such a yukata for him, but it was probably Yoruchi. The woman adored her shades of orange. It was just turning July, the days were long and warm as the duo strolled down the busy streets of the first district in North Rukongai, peering into every single roadside stall to see what caught their fancy. As an academy student hailing from Rukongai, Akira had no allowance to speak of, but his shunpa was fast enough, a side effect of training with the Shihoin clan heir, that he did occasionally get hired as a runner for interdivision memos. "Strong to believe it's only been 3 months since you graduated." Suzuki glanced sideways at Akira, who appeared to be engrossed in a stall selling ornamental butterflies. "Yeah," he agreed. "Anohana Taicho is a really strict taskmistress." Akira straightened and they moved on. "I heard combat medics are technically never off-duty." Suzuki snorted. "There's only 6 of us in the entire Godiai 13. I'm not sure how we can ever afford to go off-duty." "Really?" Akira's eyes widened. "Only 6. Suzuki nodded. "But there's at least 3 teams on patrol at any point in time," mused Akira, almost to himself. "Not to mention the graveyard shifts. What do you do if you get called in while you're asleep?" Suzuki groaned, having experienced just that situation before. "Then that Jigakucho tries its best to wake you up, or they send a runner to your house. Most of the combat medics sleep in the 4th barracks for that reason, but I split my time between the Shihoin Manor and there because of my duties to the Onmitsukido." Akira stopped walking. "What?" Suzuki pet his head to the side. What? Akira opened his mouth, frowned, closed it, and then tried again. "How can you be in the 2nd and the 4th divisions at the same time?" It was Suzuki's turn to look confused. "I'm not." "But you just said you have duties to the Onmitsukido." "Not all the Onmitsukido are members of the 2nd division," said Suzuki slowly. "Most Shihoin clan and retainer members are also a part of the Onmitsukido." "So what, you have to do Onmitsukido missions on top of your normal combat medic schedule?" "I usually get called in for backup on high-profile missions," elaborated Suzuki. "Or if immediate medical assistance is required in a live combat zone." The former did not come up very often, at most once every few months, and nowadays Yoruchi was always careful to schedule them around his off days to give him sufficient time to rest before and afterwards. The latter was slightly more commonplace, but Yoruchi generally tried to send for the 4th division instead if he happened to be off-duty, unless the mission was of a highly sensitive nature. "That's good," breathed Akira. "They're not overworking you, are they?" He examined his friend, trying to pick up any physical signs of fatigue. Suzuki shrugged. "I spent most of these 3 months studying human anatomy and physiology under the tutelage of Anohana Taicho or Yamada Fukuteicho," he confessed. "Only recently did they start sending me out on the more routine missions." They chatted casually about Suzuki's studies and Akira's classes, until the sun rose high in the sky and the day was positively sweltering. Akira declared that he was starving, and that he knew a good restaurant in the area, so would Suzuki-san please come? Seeing no reason to decline, Suzuki followed. In the shade of the awning, Akira paused. "I don't like it," he declared in a low voice. "But she begged and begged on her knees, so I'm giving her one chance." Suzuki stared at the uncharacteristic expression on Akira's face. Then he led Suzuki around the corner onto the terrace, and he understood. Himura Kid sat at a corner table, together with several members of his old class, the best Kido user over there, Hoshino Hideaki. He automatically registered, the other one with a good grasp of Zenjutsu, and was that Tozen? Before his mind ground to a halt. His feet stopped moving, and he was barely aware Akira had stopped too, beside him. This was the girl he had failed to save, in this timeline. Memories rose unbidden and crashed against each other, Kid's body in the sickbed drowned out by Rukia's mangled body, both so headstrong, so much alike, Rukia, who had died with a smile on her face and Byakuya's words still ringing in her ears, "You've become strong, Rukia." Kid was rising from her seat, having caught sight of him, and Suzuki almost flinched. Not here, not now, not in public. Not when Haka no Togame still glittered behind his closed eyelids with each blink and Byakuya's howl of anguish still reverberated in his ears. 5 years, 6 years, and he could still barely hold it together. Akira had shifted his position slightly until he was half a step in front of Suzuki, eyes wary. Assessing. Then Kid sank onto her knees, laid her hands palm up on the floor, and bowed her head. "Please forgive me, Shihoin-sama." Suzuki barely forced back the memories threatening to flood him. He would pay for that later, but he would do that in private, to focus on the present, on Himura-san, who was apparently issuing a full formal apology to him in public for no reason he could think of. He glanced at Akira, hoping that the other had a clue. "Do elaborate, Himura-san." Suzuki was taken aback at the strong edge Akira's voice had gained, at how he was staring at the girl prostrate on the ground without a flicker of sympathy in his eyes, at how none of his former classmates moved to stop her. Kid raised her head slightly, enough to speak clearly, but nowhere sufficient to look at him in the face. "They told me it was you who saved my life." Her words came out in a rush. I don't know, I was just so angry and depressed. It's easy to blame the person whom I knew had been there. When I saw that you were uninjured, I was torn between relief and anger and hurt that you had left me there to die. Then they told me you had run after me and took a Zero in the back and nearly died." Her voice hitched on the word, "that it was touch and go for a while, and if Anohana Taicho hadn't been there you wouldn't have made it." Her voice grew softer and finally trailed off. Suzuki blew out a long breath. "I accept your apology," he recited formally. When Kid looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears, he sighed and bent down, offering her a hand up. After she was upright and had been helped back into her seat by the other classmates, Akira and he were waved into the seats on the outermost of the terrace, evidently saved for them. As if summoned, a waiter appeared and began filling the table with steaming dishes. "I'm sorry, too." Conversation halted as everyone turned to stare at him. "For not being fast enough to save you before that hollow got its claws into you," he elaborated quietly. "That's not your fault." Several voices exclaimed at the same time, Kid's amongst them. "I was right there, I was awake," Akira murmured in a low, troubled voice. "Your Ryuryoku levels were so low they had to perform a transfusion right there before Anohana Taicho could even begin to heal you. If that man hadn't been there to coax you out of your Ryatsu shock." Suzuki blinked and put down his chopsticks. "What, Kisuke?" "The one who kept the Senkamen open for us," supplied Tozen quietly. Akira nodded. "Yes, you were going into shock and shutting down. Anohana Taicho couldn't do anything until he managed to get you to relax your Ryatsu, except after that you didn't have enough Ryuryoku left to kickstart the healing, so Yamato Taicho had to ask if he was willing to undergo a transfusion procedure." Akira stopped and ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "And he just nodded and asked Yamato Taicho to take as much as he needed." Suzuki could understand his consternation. Ryuryoku transfusion was a terribly disorienting procedure for the donator, since the body could only register that it was losing energy for no reason at all. Homeostasis control centers in physiological systems, especially the nervous system, would go out of control as the body tried to restore equilibrium, and there were many common symptoms such as phantom pain and dizziness. Until today, he had not known how close he had actually come to dying. He had been too used to measuring injuries with respect to his original immense Ryatsu pressure. A Ciro from a Minos Grande would have barely left a scratch, certainly not a debilitating injury. Suzuki picked up his chopsticks again. It seemed that he owed Kisuke a proper thank you and another apology later. Speaking of whom, there was a flutter of green in the corner of his eye. Suzuki nearly dropped his tempura on the table as he snapped his head around, unable to believe his peripheral vision. "What are you doing here?" Urahara Kisuke was ambling up the street, dressed in a casual forest green kosode and matching hakama, his customary fan dangling from one hand. In fact, had Suzuki not known specifically that Kisuke was actually on duty today, courtesy of one too many irate Soifan rants, he would have thought that the other was off duty as well. "I can see why Soifan thinks he's such a slacker," he snorted mentally. Instead of replying directly, Kisuke simply changed his direction slightly, such that he was now headed directly for the terrace they were seated at. "Sorry to interrupt," he nodded politely at the assembled students before turning his attention to Suzuki. "Yoruchi-san wants you to know she has a meeting with one of the retainer clans later, so she won't be home for dinner." Suzuki blinked at him. She could have sent a Jigakucho for that. Sending the third Sikh to play messenger boy. "I wanted to ask if you wanted to eat out tonight," Kisuke continued as if he had not spoken. "When do I have to be back?" If Yoruchi was away, so would Soifan, meaning that it was just him in the main clan building. If he did not need to report back for dinner. Kisuke lifted up one shoulder in a casual shrug. "Whenever you like." "Okay, just let me inform my..." Suzuki trailed off, casting his Ryatsu out to feel for the signatures of his protection detail, who were normally skulking in some back street somewhere. Or, given this heat, possibly tucked in another corner of this restaurant enjoying their lunch. "Where did my guards go?" Suzuki asked out loud in confusion, then elaborated for his avidly watching tablemates, "Since I'm the clan heir, I'm supposed to remain within the sensory range of an Onmitsukido officer at all times." Kisuke had propped his cheek on the railing separating the terrace from the street, waiting with patient bemusement while Suzuki was futilely scanning his surroundings. Now he snickered, raised a hand and gave a little wave. "Hi." Suzuki blinked at him and started to laugh. "Nandeo, you slacker." Kisuke rolled his eyes. "This is the gratitude I get for volunteering for this job. You could have been stuck with some junior officers, who would spend their entire time thinking they're tailing you, discreetly, whining audibly about babysitting a kid, when they could be doing real work. Suzuki could practically hear the air quotes. "And invariably, in an actual situation, who will need you to bail them out." He grinned unrepentantly when Suzuki broke into fresh peals of laughter at the all-too-plausible scenario. "So, dinner? Only if you're paying." There was a beat of silence as Kisuke gave him a blank look. "What? Of course I'm paying, scratch that, the Shihoin clan is paying, actually," he said slowly. "Why did you even mention it?" It was Suzuki's turn to be confused. "Since when can you claim reimbursement for private meals?" Kisuke straightened leisurely, sending alarm bells ringing through Suzuki's head. How many times had he seen Kisuke move so deceptively languidly, when an enemy was near? Though his gray eyes did not lose their playfulness, which went a long way to reassure Suzuki that nothing was seriously wrong. "Because today is the 14th of July. Suzuki fixed him with an uncomprehending look. The fan fluttered. "And tomorrow is?" Kisuke prompted. 15th July, Suzuki answered automatically. He blinked and repeated that to himself. "Wait, what?" Kisuke leaned back on the railing and began to laugh at the flushed embarrassment rising in Suzuki's cheeks. Did you just? He had to cut himself off when it became too much for him to enunciate clearly through his peals of laughter. Shut up. As Kisuke opened his mouth again, Suzuki snatched up his chopsticks and stuffed the first thing he could reach, the tempura, into Kisuke's mouth before he could continue the sentence. The other man had to pause his teasing while he chewed and swallowed, but he was still shaking silently with mirth. Suzuki stole a glance at the other students, who were all staring avidly at them, evidently waiting for the punchline, and passed a hand over his eyes. Forget your own birthday. Now Kisuke was not the only one laughing. Seriously? He heard Akira's voice in the background and groaned. I just lost track of the date, all right. So you can understand my reaction, Kisuke finished. Why would I take you out for your birthday, and then make you pay? Kisuke. Suzuki was not whining, he really was not. At the sound of the blonde's name, however, the other members of his former class sat up. This is him? Tozen asked. The one who kept the Senkamen open for us, elaborated Hideaki. Suzuki made a noise of understanding. Everyone, this is Urahara Kisuke, the third seed of the second division, and the person responsible for the Senkamen that day. Kisuke, my former classmates. He gestured. As one, everyone rose and bowed silently to the blonde, who straightened in response, the teasing glint vanishing from his eyes. Thank you for saving all our lives, Urahara-san, Keed spoke sincerely for all of them. The look in Kisuke's eyes softened and he looked a little awkward. There is no need for gratitude, he replied formally. There was a stilted silence when nobody knew what to say. Ano, would you like to join us for lunch, suggested Mikoto, one of the other girls. No, thank you, demurred Kisuke. I'm a little busy actually. His fan came up and tapped against his lips. Suzuki gave him a sidelong glance. What sort of Onmitsukido mission required casual wear? And for that matter, he scrutinized the blonde properly, realizing with a jolt that his clothing was made of silk instead of cotton and catching the faint fragrance of sandalwood, and barely managed to keep his mouth from dropping open, really expensive casual wear. As if magically summoned, two simultaneous beeping sounds started. Suzuki frowned and dove for his denryashinki, recognizing the sound. What happened? Kisuke hummed, gray eyes scanning his own denryashinki rapidly. Small situation just came up. That was a general backup request sent to everyone within range. He reached over and deftly flicked Suzuki's denryashinki alarm off, plunging the table back into silence. Do you need? Suzuki began to rise from his seat, but then cut himself off. Right, sorry, stupid question. Kisuke only smiled and laid a hand on his shoulder, pressing him firmly back into his seat. Sit. Day off. Let the one actually on duty handle it. Ja. Suzuki turned his attention back to the group, only to find all of them staring at him. What? He asked defensively. Was it still about the birthday thing? Nothing, Akira told him in an odd tone. I've just never seen you laugh so much. Suzuki blinked and rewound the past few minutes in his mind. Akira was right, he rarely laughed like that in public. It was usually only one of his closest friends or family who could bring out that side of him anymore. The rest of the meal was finished in high spirits, with everyone trading anecdotes back and forth that had the rest of the table in stitches. Are you sure it's all right for you to leave? Keed asked worriedly when the time came for them to depart. Sure. Suzuki replied, not seeing the problem. I mean, Keed explained. Wasn't he supposed to be your guard? What if he came back and couldn't find you? Suzuki smiled easily. He can track my Ryatsu signature, that's not a problem. They filed out of the door, making their way to a less crowded place to continue chatting. Don't you have to be within a certain range for him to track your Ryatsu signature? Asked Hideaki, as they flopped onto a grassy knoll on the outskirts of the town, close enough to the forest to be shaded by the tree line. I am within his sensory range so long as I stay in Junranen. He swirled his tea absently and drained the last of it. Suzuki lowered his takeaway cup to see the rest of them staring at him. That, Akira summed it for them succinctly, doesn't sound like what a normal third seat can do. Oh, Suzuki snorted. He's the third seat because Yorochine-sama ran out of higher positions to promote him to. There was an odd silence at that. Tell us more about him. Suzuki considered the starry-eyed students in front of him. Sure, what do you want to know? What's he like in a battle? How strong is he? When's his birthday? Everyone turned to stare at Hideaki, who ducked his head slightly but refused to back down. He prefers to use Kido, Suzuki answered in turn, trying not to cackle at the idea of Kisuke having fans. In fact, he was the one who invented my favorite Heido, Jugeki Byakurai. I'm not exactly sure how strong he is, at least captain level, and his birthday is December 31st. More than a few mental notes appeared to be made about the last point. Captain level? Asked Mikoto, looking deeply interested. Yes, confirmed Suzuki. What's his specialist field? She continued. It must be his Kido, asserted Hideaki, the resident aspiring Kido specialist. Only Kido MSTRS, usually the best of the Kidoshu, can invent new Kido. Their heads snapped to Suzuki as though awaiting a verdict. How's his Hakuda and Ho-Ho? Asked Akira. Aggressively. Suzuki shrugged. Well, he spars with Yorochine-sama on a regular basis. He trailed off meaningfully. Their eyes widened and they fell to discussing amongst themselves. Phrases like can keep up with the goddess of Flash and Kido MSTR were bandied about liberally, while Suzuki watched them in bemusement. What do you think, Suzuki-san? Tozen asked. They were back to staring at him. Suzuki hummed thoughtfully. What did he feel was Kisuke's specialization? The man was a MSTR of all 4 Shinigami combat disciplines, a genius inventor, and a zealous scientist. But none of these detached labels seemed to describe the man he knew, the man who spent sleepless nights monitoring the Vizier's conditions, the man who threw himself wholeheartedly into his work, the man who once coaxed a 15-year-old teenager to stand up and then taught him to fight on par with captains in 3 days. I think it's his passion, he finally replied. Even as he said it he knew it was true. Yorochi had once told him, and he wholeheartedly agreed, that although Kisuke appeared to coast through life with a happy-go-lucky attitude, he had the tendency to go over the top with the few things that he was truly passionate about. The others blinked at the seemingly non-sequitur reply, but sensing that Suzuki would not elaborate, did not push for more. Conversation faded away as they laid back and stared up at the clouds floating across the summer sky. More than one of them was lulled to sleep by the drowsiness of a good meal and the gentle winds that swept past. Worried about him? Akira asked in a low tone. Not really, Suzuki replied truthfully. I just wonder what sort of Onmitsukido mission would take place in the first district of all places. They debated lazily, each offering up increasingly absurd suggestions, but could not come up with a plausible mission given the lack of details. As the afternoon wore on, being the spirit equivalent of teenagers and thus perpetually hungry, several of them made trips back into town to purchase snacks. Suzuki was one of them, and he returned with a plate of yakitori which met with great favor. The ones awake for it sat in silence as the sun finally set, painting the horizon in a kaleidoscope of colors. It was a perfect summer evening. The chirping of crickets in the grass, the low voices of conversing friends, the bustling of a town getting ready for the dinner rush, the howls of hollows in the distance. Wait, what? Akira sat up suddenly, all traces of sleep gone. Did you hear that? He demanded of the group at large. Most of those talking to each other stared at him in confusion, but Tozen was sitting ramrod straight, head turned to the right. Low-level hollows, at least 4, 2 kilometers away in a direction approximately 130 degrees clockwise of our current location, supplied Suzuki from his position supine on the grass, eyes closed. Conversation halted as another howl broke the silence, louder this time. "How can you be so nonchalant?" wondered Kid out loud, her knuckles white where they clutched the grass. Suzuki opened his eyes but made no move to get up. "There's no one in danger, we're the closest, and they're coming this way instead of the town, probably due to our Ryatsu output." There was a beat, then the other students were scrambling up, getting into battle stances. Suzuki tugged the last bit of yakitori off the skewer with his teeth and chewed languidly. "Back up 100 meters that way," he said suddenly, pointing in the opposite direction of where the hollows were coming from, "and fan out, we don't want them to reach the town." No sooner had they done so, did the first hollow burst out from the woods, heading for the closest high Ryuryoku individual it could see. Suzuki twirled his skewer absently between his fingers and swallowed the last of his chicken. The claws were so close to his nose that he had felt the displacement of air on his cheeks when it shattered into Ryuryoku particles. A shadow fell over his supine form. "You're late," Suzuki informed him conversationally. "Sorry to keep your highness waiting," snarked back Kisuk. "What if I'd gotten hurt?" Kisuk gave him an incredulous look. "By these? I'd just laugh at you. And then I'll tell Yoruchi-san, and she'll tease you about it for the next decade." "So true," Suzuki sighed, hoisting himself up casually and dusting himself off, seemingly oblivious of the claws that smashed into where he had been lying a moment before, and which would have impaled him had he not moved. He fixed Kisuk with an imploring look. "Capture, pretty please." Kisuk sighed, surveying the arrayed hollows, which had appeared while they were speaking. "So that's why you were baiting them?" He snapped his fingers. Sigh. Like puppets with their strings cut, all 4 hollows collapsed on the grass. The blonde turned to dip a shallow bow at the students running towards them. "All yours." "Thank you, Urahara-san Seiki," they chorused in unison. Cautiously, they advanced, then gradually grew bolder and set to practicing their skills on the restrained hollows. Even Kid had stepped up, and was gleefully kicking away at one of them. "Using live hollows for training exercises, Suki-chan." Suzuki sent back the mental equivalent of a shrug. "It's the second time in a year that they've been attacked on patrol, they need to learn how to deal with them." "Was it the 4th that taught you how to lure hollows?" "Yeah." Suzuki saw no reason to hide it. "Raise your Ryatsu to cover the others' signatures, place yourself closest to the swarming hollows and present as defenseless a target as possible," he recited. Heido number 31, Shikaho. A flash of red splashed onto the hollow's mask, but did not manage to break through. "Your Ryatsu output is too unstable." And suddenly Kisuk was no longer beside him, was beside Hideaki, gesturing with his hands. "Calm down, regulate it, now pull out the necessary amount to begin, yes, like that, you're doing well, and recite the incantation. Yes, that's right, let the Ryuryoku flow to your hand, don't try to consciously force it, now try again." Heido number 31, Shikaho. The beam of red light was far stronger this time, slamming against the hollow's mask and this time successfully creating a crack. "Thank you so much, Urahara-san Seiki." The boy bowed deeply, the bow a student would offer to their teacher. It was only because Suzuki had been looking right at Kisuk at that moment that he caught it, a flicker of a startled hesitation, before it was gone as quickly as it came, and Kisuk bowed awkwardly back. In the split second that the blonde lowered his head, a shadow pounced from atop the trees. Catching the movement in his peripheral vision, Suzuki had whirled around before he had even understood what was going on, Ryatsu gathering in his hand. The Ryatsu-enhanced yakitori stick had left his hand before his mind had caught up with his instinctive actions, and neatly skewered the hollow between its eyes with sufficient impact to disintegrate it on contact. There was a beat when nobody even breathed. Then Kisuk clamped down the wave of Ryatsu he had automatically flooded the area with the moment Suzuki moved, and straightened. "Had you felt that?" Suzuki demanded as he retrieved the skewer for proper disposal. He had not sensed the hollow, which was highly unexpected but not impossible, and very, very, worrying. Kisuke turned slowly to face him. Not until it had begun its attack. His gray eyes were large in his face, body still tensed for battle. Suzuki revised the possibility of additional threats significantly upwards. Right, he told everyone briskly. Finish off the rest of those hollows, and back up a bit from the tree line. Kisuke, can you do an active scan? Without replying, Kisuke turned to the forest, and Suzuki could feel the wash of Ryatsu brush past him, extending outwards. Behind them, the dying howls of the captured hollows sounded in rapid succession. Then Kisuke pulled his Ryatsu back. I think, he enunciated the words slowly. These are the remnants of those hollows that had hunted that patrol from the 3rd Division all the way from District 72 this morning. No Garganta? Suzuki asked, just to be sure. Cunning, capable of tracking and hunting prey, and able to hide from those not actively seeking them, these hollows were moderately more intelligent than the run-of-the-mill variety, but still not a major threat now that their presence had been revealed. He received a terse shake of the head in reply and a sidelong look. Are you armed? Kisuke asked abruptly. Suzuki eyed him. Are you? Kisuke shot him a look. I'm guarding the heir to the clan today, he began in an exasperated tone. Yoruchi-san will have my head had I turned up unarmed. Suzuki sighed. Give me a bit. He loosened his obi until he could slip his hand into the folds, and retrieved Kurairashi from where it had been secured against his chst, sealed into the form of a tiny tanto for the occasion. A disbelieving snort. Really? Suzuki flushed as he retied his obi. How else am I supposed to fit my zanpakuto into a yukata? With a whispered gratitude, the zanpakuto lengthened back into its original size. Your sleeves. Suzuki rolled his eyes and raised his left arm, shaking the billowing sleeve loose to reveal the band of bow shuriken strapped around his forearm, near the elbow. Kisuke's eyebrows went up. Spine holster. Suzuki shot him an incredulous look, gesturing to his clothing. How would that help if I have to practically strip to even reach the zanpakuto in the first place? Kisuke's lips twitched, looking more and more amused. Okay, when we get back, we're going to go to Yoruchi-san, and we're going to wheedle her into full ceremonial attire, and you can see how she does it. Wouldn't the servants be asleep by then? Suzuki asked cluelessly. How is she going to put them on by herself? Kisuke shot him another look. Right, I forget. Urahara Kisuke can do everything. Including, apparently, how to put on all 12 pieces of a furusode. More than that, Kisuke supplied, and he could see the older man try very strong to suppress a laugh. Since she's the clan head, there's a few additional Cayman embossed pieces for decorative purposes. Wait, Akira broke in. This Yoruchi-san you two speak of, you're talking about the head of the Shihoin clan? Suzuki and Kisuke exchanged a fleeting glance. Yes. Akira opened his mouth, glanced at Kisuke, closed it again and shook his head. Oh, we're re-ally good friends, Kisuke told them in a sing-song voice, his fan fluttering about his face. Isn't that right, Suzuki-chan? Without bothering to give a verbal reply, Suzuki unsheathed Kurairashi, and sprang. At the last second, Kisuke sidestepped smoothly out of the way and spun to the right, lips moving soundlessly. A fan of red energy blasted into the hollow that had just bounded out of the woods, knocking it backwards and incinerating it in a flash. The flames roared higher, leaping for its nearby companions, which were too slow to get out of the way. With his mobility severely hampered by the yukata, Suzuki's only option was to increase his shunpa speed to compensate for his inability to dodge. His initial lunge was true, and the hollow that had crept up behind Kisuke had barely managed to shriek before its mask shattered. With a twist of his Ryatsu, the first of the cold iron throwing darts slid free of its holster, thudded into his left palm, and just as quickly left his fingers to nail the next hollow through the thinnest part of its mask. Its dying howl rang as he put on a burst of speed and slipped underneath the swipe of another hollow's claws, leaping up to cleave its mask into two. His eyes swept the left side of the forest, Ryatsu raised as a preventive barrier, but no more movement came from the darkened tree line. He could feel Kisuke somewhere behind him, the other man's Ryatsu a solid presence guarding his back. Fingering another bow shuriken, Suzuki extended his own Ryatsu outwards, trying to get a lock on the errant hollows. There. A thrown dart forced the first one out of the safety of the woods, and Suzuki flashed forwards to bury his Zanpakuto into its companion. Only his finely honed battle instincts caused him to whirl around at the right moment, nearly tripping over his yukata, to see another hollow, previously hidden by the shadows of the trees, bearing down upon him. Even as he raised his Zanpakuto to block, he knew it wasn't fast enough, nor was his Ryatsu concentrated enough, there would be no avoiding injury. A hand caught his wrist firmly, and like nails on a chalkboard, the hollow's claws screeched off the fan. No, not fan. Now that it was unfurled he could clearly see it was a tessen, Kisuke had been holding the entire time. Stepping out of the range of his swing, Kisuke released Suzuki's wrist, allowing him to step up and finish off the hollow. Waves of Ryatsu pulsed out in another active scan, ensuring there were no hollows remaining. Only when the other man gave him a short nod did Suzuki sheath his Zanpakuto and move to pick up his throwing darts. "I need to call this in," Kisuke murmured regretfully, flipping his Denryashinki open and absently scrolling. Suzuki nodded, having expected as much. "Then I'll go home and change first. What should I wear?" "Something black," Kisuke muttered vaguely, tapping away at the buttons. "Your Onmitsukido uniform." "Okay." Suzuki drawled slowly. "Where are we going?" "Oh, out." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the second district, eyes still glued to the screen. Suzuki raised a quizzical eyebrow. Kisuke glanced up and sighed. "Are you feeling all right today?" He made an expansive, elaborate gesture as he spoke. "We're going out to celebrate your birthday together." "Oh!" Suzuki exclaimed before he could stop himself. Even then, he could not prevent the huge grin spreading over his face. "Shall I meet you at the manor gates?" "Actually." Suzuki had stiffened immediately at the sudden change in tone, his hand drifting to his Zanpakuto hilt. "Change of plans," continued Kisuke smoothly, shutting his Denryashinki with a decisive snap. "Go to your quarters in the 4th barracks, change, and I'll meet you in the waiting area in the infirmary." He began striding off, paused, and turned around. "Understood." Suzuki swallowed and saluted. "Hi." Without another word out loud, Kisuke set off for Siriidii at a brisk walk. 0, 7, 23, 2, 4, 41, 47, 4. "Take the main roads, I'll see you in 20 minutes. Suzuki tightened his grip briefly on the Zanpakuto in his hand at the message meant for him alone, before he got himself under control. At a much slower pace, the rest of them too set off for Siriidii. "How can he address Shihoin-sama so familiarly?" whispered Akira in a quiet voice. Suzuki hesitated slightly before deciding to simply confirm Kisuke's words earlier. "It's true, they are really good friends." Akira glanced at him askance at the vague answer, but did not inquire further. They parted at the north gate, the other students heading back to the academy while Suzuki slipped into the crowd moving towards the Gotei 13 section of Siriidii. The moment the crowds cleared, few would willingly visit the 4th on a fine Saturday evening. Suzuki broke into as fast a shuanpa as he could manage without tripping over his yukata, headed towards the 4th's barracks. He barreled into his quarters a scant few moments later, very thankful for the fact that as a combat medic, not to mention a member of one of the 5 great noble houses, he had a private room to himself. Stripping his yukata off, finally, he tugged on the sleeveless undershirt and stretched breaths of the Onmitsukido, yanking his wrist guards into place over the bow shuriken and strapping his Zanpakuto to his back. He would have to thoroughly clean the ones he had used later, but for now they would have to suffice since there were no spare weapons in his public quarters. Suzuki frowned at his reflection in the mirror. Too conspicuous. He switched to a sleeveless black kosode instead and added arm warmers over the wrist guards. He winced slightly. Well, he still stood out, but he no longer looked like he was going on a mission. It would have to do. Raising a hand to the Shinigami manning the reception, Suzuki dropped into one of the seats in the reception area of the infirmary, back against the wall. Keeping an eye on both the entrance and the corridor leading out into the courtyard, he let himself sink into a light meditative trance, seeking out unerringly the red Ryatsu ribbon connected to his soul. Happy birthday. Awareness blossomed slowly on the other end of the connection, and although Yukimura did not reply, Suzuki knew that he had heard. That's tomorrow. Suzuki snorted mentally, careful to keep his face blank of emotion. I'm off duty today, he replied instead. A beat, and despite the seemingly non-sequitur, Yukimura unerringly picked up his meaning. Should I warn Okasan for a guest, then? 2, corrected Suzuki. Taking orders for dinner. A longer pause this time, presumably as Yukimura relayed the message to Masaki. Chocolate, came the hopeful voice. For dinner. He could hear Yukimura's laugh. All right then. I don't suppose we can get a tabe hodai spread, like in an izakaya. I'll see what we can do, promised Suzuki. A new voice cut into their conversation. I'm outside the division gates. Giving another wave to the Shinigami on duty, Suzuki meandered slowly out of the infirmary. On my way, he told Yukimura, and released the connection. We're waiting, floated back, and he bit back another grin. Kisuke was waiting for him right where he said he would be, also having changed into black at some point. His Zanpakuto too was prominently displayed, but on his hip. In Seriidii, this was so common a sight that no one gave him a second look as Suzuki fell into step beside him. Situation update. The other man gave a tiny shake of the head, as though trying to remove a lock of hair blocking his vision. What would you like for dinner? Suzuki bounced. A bit of everything. Kisuke gave him a sidelong glance. And chocolate, I suppose. Suzuki gave a huff in reply. I like chocolate. Visibly biting back a teasing retort, Kisuke instead led the way to several restaurants that also did takeaway, only shooting Suzuki a glare when he thoughtlessly asked if they should split up. I doubt you can afford all that your bottomless pit of a stomach needs. It would have been one of Kisuke's usual teasing comments, but the remarkably realistic grin never lit up his eyes. Flinching minutely, Suzuki accepted the implicit scolding for what it was. Despite the sheer number of purchases that they made, they still managed to make relatively good time out of the East Gate, Kisuke proclaiming out loud that they should find somewhere to sit and enjoy their food before it went cold. Once out of the town in District 1, Kisuke threw cloaks over them both, allegedly to ward off the evening chill. Feeling the smother of Ryatsu concealing Kido built into the cloak, Suzuki broke into top Shunpa speed as soon as it was secured, Kisuke right behind him. They landed noiselessly on the roof, and dropped just as soundlessly onto the ground, melting away into the shadows. We're here. Up close, there was no need to even seek out Yukimura's Ryatsu ribbon, it was a beacon in his mind. With a soft click, the window unlatched and 2 blurs darted into the bedroom, following the shadowed figure into the darkened dining room, where there were no windows to give away the light. Really, the window? Suzuki asked as they put down their purchases on the table. Yukimura shrugged eloquently. Doors too loud. Movement at the door indicated Masaki's arrival, who paused slightly upon seeing a stranger in her house. Without hesitation, Yukimura strode over to the blonde and wrapped an arm around his shoulders. Catching on immediately, Kisuke returned the half-hug immediately. Happy birthday, Yukimura. Good to see you again, Kisuke. He let the other man go and turned to Masaki. Oka-san, this is Urahara Kisuke, my brother's personal guard. He spent a lot of time with us before Yoruchi-san adopted my brother. Kisuke offered a 30-degree bow to her. Hajimashite, Masaki-san. Feeling Masaki begin to relax as she echoed the traditional greeting, Suzuki moved to cut in. What, I don't merit a hug. He pouted ostentatiously, making the other three laugh even as Yukimaru moved to wrap both arms around him. Kisuke busied himself unpacking all the food they brought, laying out bowls of rice, dishes of boiled edamame and tsukmino, a tray of artfully arranged sushi, plates of yasai and ebi tempura, arrays of ajidashi tofu and nasu, skewers of kushiyaki, a giant platter piled high with taiyaki and senbei wrapped in nori, as well as a heat-proof container filled with still-hot sencha. Does this meet with your Majesty's expectations? Teased Suzuki as Masaki moved to fetch mugs for the tea. That depends, Yukimaru retorted mock solemnly, on whether you have brought the sacred offering. Suzuki snorted and laid the final item on the platter of desserts, a single bar of chocolate. A new import from the human world, chocolate was only available in a tiny shop in Siriidii at outrageous prices currently only affordable to the upper nobility. That tiny chocolate bar had cost more than all the other food items added together. Itadakimasu. Yukimaru immediately reached for the inarizushi, while Masaki picked up her rice bowl. More used to regular meals, Suzuki picked elegantly at the edamame while Kisuke served himself several slices of sashimi. Is that otoro? Kisuke paused at Yukimaru's exclamation, a slice of the aforementioned fish halfway to his mouth. Yes. Yukimaru groaned enviously. What kind of salary are you getting? Way more than me, interjected Suzuki before Kisuke could flutter his fan and deflect the question, emphasizing his point with a piece of fugu. Now that I've graduated, I don't even get an allowance. Masaki gasped upon recognizing the fish. Isn't that banned? Only in Rukongai, there's still several sushi shops licensed to serve fugu in Siriidii, explained Kisuke. He eyed the potentially toxic slice of fish dangling from Suzuki's chopsticks. Monitor your own status, will you? It'll be troublesome if you went and died. Suzuki nodded, snagged. Kisuke's dish of sauce. Dipped the fish into the shoyu, and put it in his mouth. Tapping 2 fingers against the Ryatsu vent on his left wrist, he pulled up a real-time diagnostic screen using a modified medical keto originally developed to monitor the status of patients during delicate or prolonged operations in the field. Masaki watched the proceedings with interest. Yuki tells me that you are working as a combat medic? Suzuki nodded and swallowed his gari. Yes, there are 3 subdivisions in the 4th division, the infirmary medics, the field medics, and the combat medics. The infirmary medics are trained to keep the Sogo Kyugo Tsumesho operational round the clock, led by the 4th seat. The field medics are sent on missions as support healers, while the combat medics serve as the primary response team. What's the difference between combat medics and field medics? Field medics generally stay out of battle, explained Suzuki, having answered this very question many times before. They set up a mobile relief station near the actual battlefield, far enough that they won't be caught in the crossfire, so that they can concentrate on healing the wounded without worrying about being attacked. They're trained to operate all the equipment and perform delicate operations. He took a sip of his tea and continued. Combat medics are heavily involved in actual combat. Often, Shinigami get critically injured in the middle of a battle, where it's too dangerous to send in field medics, but they may die if not treated in time. Combat medics are sent to the front lines to retrieve these fallen Shinigami and ensure they reach the relief station in time. There's only 6 of you, right? Yukimaru asked, chewing on his kapamaki. Suzuki answered in the affirmative. Most Shinigami who choose the 4th division are generally less suitable for combat, he elaborated diplomatically. To start, we need very high levels of Ryatsu, much more than the average Shinigami. Due to the demands of the job, we have to travel very light, so we learn to manipulate our Ryatsu to achieve the same effects as specialized equipment. For instance, Major BLD Loss, the number 1 killer, in virtually all locations can be temporarily suppressed by flooding the area with concentrated Ryatsu. Kisuke made an interested noise at that. Have you considered the alternative applications of Bakudo? He nodded. I'll be learning some specialized Kaido to supplement my repertoire as well after I mstr the basic medical Kido. Give me a list later, I'm sure I can think of some more, instructed Kisuke, spinning his chopsticks absently over his knuckles as he contemplated the issue. Show off, coughed Yukimaru, then had to snag a skewer, which was flicked at his forehead, mid-flight. Do you want to become a Shinigami too, Yuki? Masaki asked, possibly to derail an impending food fight from breaking out. Yukimaru frowned as he considered the question, chewing idly on a piece of aubergine. Not at the moment, I think. He shot her a winning smile. I'd like to stay with you for a while longer. Masaki beamed at him, for a moment so alike the woman from his childhood memories that it made something inside Suzuki ache. He contented himself with stabbing a piece of ajidashi tofu perhaps a little more violently than necessary, earning himself two concerned looks from the other two men at the table. Shaking his head minutely, he sat back and listened to the conversation drift on to other topics, occasionally offering his input, but mostly relaxing in the presence of three people he trusted, a soothing change from his hectic schedule lately. It was when the desserts were mostly finished that Suzuki finally broached the topic that had been at the back of his mind the whole night. So, what prompted the priority code earlier? Priority code, echoed Yukimaru. Kisuke laid his chopsticks down with a quiet click, and took a moment to consider his words. Certain ostensibly inconsequential and unconnected circumstances have conspired in such a manner that I am compelled to conclude that their concurrence is not as coincidental as they would claim to be. Suzuki and Yukimaru exchanged grim looks at the lapse into formal speech patterns. As you noted earlier, I had been dressed for a mission rather than guard duty, he began. Normally, you would have remained within visual range of an officer at all times, however, just this morning I was suddenly requested to take over because your original guard had taken ill and there are no other seated officers available. Suzuki frowned. Is that even possible? A quarter of them, including Omida Morenishin, is off duty today. Of the rest, half are currently on missions outside Siriidii, 2 are ill, and the remaining are part of Yoruchi-san's retinue. This means that for most of today, I had been the only seated officer of the Onmitsukido present in Siriidii. He paused briefly. In light of this, I consider the fact that my mission was irrevocably delayed by 2 hours with no satisfactory explanation, that a supposedly straightforward negotiation was plagued with sufficient unforeseen complications to render it a total failure, that I was repeatedly called out of range of my charge. I remained within your range, argued Suzuki. Kisuke pursed his lips. Within my actual sensory range, yes, but not within my publicly known sensory range, and certainly not within response range for most of the afternoon. What's the difference? Questioned Yukimaru. Sensory range is defined as the ability to track the location of a Ryatsu signature, the blonde detailed slowly, while response range for a personal guard would be the ability to detect and respond to a threat within 10 seconds. For most Shinigami these would usually be around the same distance, but partly due to my familiarity with Suzuki I am able to track him over a vastly greater distance than I can passively scan for potential danger. In fact, he continued, tone icy, I was only alerted to the presence of hollows because Suzuki had suddenly raised his Ryatsu output. Hollows that appeared in North District 1 despite the lack of a Garganta, that only appeared when for all intents and purposes he was unprotected, that ostensibly were part of the group that had chased that patrol to the West Gate, and that included a type that Suzuki is publicly known to be unable to readily detect. But Yukimaru too was frowning. Low-level hollows aren't much of a menace. With 8 academy students nearby, and Suzuki having a known reputation for putting his life in danger to protect them, rebutted Kisuke tartly. He's right, Suzuki interrupted, grimacing at the reminder. I've only escaped injury because my reflexes are way better than they should have been, and both of us were carrying more weapons than expected. And they were no doubt expecting you to trip over your yukata at some point, added Kisuke, not unkindly. You've so rarely worn traditional attire during your 5 years as clan heir that it should have greatly hampered your mobility. Had he been wounded, Yukimaru murmured with dawning horror, he would have returned to the Shihoin manor to recuperate. Which, as aforementioned, is completely devoid of guards, Kisuke finished grimly. When I became aware of all these, it became imperative that you do not return to the manor tonight. And thus the priority code. And thus the priority code, agreed Kisuke. Every eventuality that could have been feasibly planned for has been taken into account, and the only reason why we are here is because of what the masterminds could not have known. Especially, I suspect, that Suzuki, the rebellious, forthright clan heir, is willing to obey orders from a third seat who by all means appear to have achieved the position due to personal favors rather than actual skill. Suzuki automatically opened his mouth to refute the last point, before realizing that it was exactly how most people up and including Soifun perceived the blonde, who in turn encouraged the misconception. I'll spend the night in the 4th barracks, he conceded. Suzuki sat slumped outside the walls surrounding the 4th Division in the dead of the night, leaning against the cool stone. It was one of the walls bordering the open fields behind the 4th Division Medical Center, far away from any buildings. Rarely did he get to be alone nowadays, when he was not studying, training, or performing his duties. He knew what Akira had been driving at earlier, he really did. Shinigami were not expected to hold 2 jobs at the same time, much less of this caliber. But what choice did he have? Suzuki rolled his head up to stare sightlessly at the sky above. I'm sick of trying to perform the Onmitsukido duties on top of my actual job. There. He had said it out loud. Even if there was no one around to hear him. Suzuki stared into the distance, where he could just make out the walls surrounding the 5th Division. He put his head in his hands. Just because you adopted me doesn't mean you own me, he burst out, muffled by his palms. Suzuki remained in that position, BLD roaring in his ears, until his pendant grew warm against his CHST. He then rose unsteadily, putting a hand against the wall to brace himself for a moment, and padded silently back into his room in 4th barracks. To be continued. Extra disclaimer, the line, "You've become strong, Rukia," belongs to Tight Kubo, although it's used in a different scene from canon. Japanese. Kenji's Shirkai release, Midoredabu, Tetsuo fly about wildly, Iron Hawk. Nandeo, you slacker, in this specific instance, may be meaningfully translated as, oh my god / what the hell, you slacker. It has an extra dimension of informality that I doubt you care about, and if you do care I don't think you need me to translate the Japanese for you. The code, 0723244147-4, reads, quite simply, priority call, unfriendly Shinigami, exact numbers unknown, Urahara Kisuke determines highly likely threat will occur within the next 12 hours, exact time unknown, to Yoruchi and Suzuki, potentially lethal. Original cipher in basic Japanese. All food items listed here, as far as possible, are confirmed to have existed during this era.